Hello and welcome back. This is the week 4 lecture. So, as I think I mentioned last week, we have a lot to cover here today. So, I provided some biographical information about the four authors that we're really focusing on the most this week. So, Anne Bradstreet, Phyllis Wheatley, Philip Freneau, and Hugh Henry Brackenridge. So I'm going to talk about all four of them today over the course of lecture, but I don't really have time to provide a lot of literary analysis like I typically would. We're not going to visit a lot of specific passages in these texts. I'm just going to talk about the authors and their works pretty generally today because I have to provide a sort of history lesson because we are, as I've said, covering a lot of ground. So today we're basically moving from the early stages of English colonization in what is now the U.S. We're going to move from that all the way up to the end of the 18th century, roughly. So we're going to cover about 150 years, a little bit more of actual history, of actual literary history. So obviously we cannot be comprehensive. We're not going to be able to cover everything, and we're obviously not going to be able to read everything. So this is an overview that I'm providing today. This is a survey, and hopefully it will give us a general idea of this early stage of U.S. literary culture, the development of a U.S. literary culture, and hopefully this just gets us more comfortable with this early period, or really multiple periods of early U.S. literary history. So one thing that you guys might want to do before I get started here today, as you're listening to me, you might want to pull up that PowerPoint that I posted to the week 4 module. I don't typically worry about PowerPoints at this level. I mean, I use them in 101, but I don't typically use them in here. But this week is the one exception, just because we are covering so much ground. So I've only posted 4 slides. That's really all you need. And it's just basically a way for you guys to get all of these authors, all of these titles, and all of these years of publication that I'm sort of going through today in lecture. If you look at those slides, you'll have a visual aid to sort of use as you listen to me. So that might be a good idea. That's why I included those slides. So we're sort of beginning roughly where we left off last week with John Smith's expedition narrative. So obviously I spent most of the week 3 lecture discussing Native American folktales and the trickster figure. I hope you guys enjoyed that, but now we're sort of switching back, for better or worse, we're sort of switching back to a more traditional vision of sort of Anglo-American history. And that doesn't mean that we have to leave Native Americans and Native American literary traditions behind completely. But this week, we're going to sort of get back into colonization, which is sort of unfortunate, but a reality that we have to confront, just like we confronted it at the very beginning with Spanish colonization in Cabeza de Vaca. So we're kind of getting back to where John Smith was taking us last week with his expedition narrative. So we didn't talk about it much. I didn't ask you guys to read very much of it, but I did notice that a lot of you wrote about it on the discussion board, and you were finding a lot of interesting similarities and differences when comparing it to Cabeza de Vaca. But just from sort of a practical and historical standpoint, I think I mentioned this last week, at least briefly, his description of New England was published in 1616. Really just, it predated the beginning, the sort of early Puritan expeditions just by a few years. So some of the work that he did, some of the maps that he helped to create of the Atlantic coast, some of the information that he included in his expedition narrative, that stuff was put to use by some of these early Puritan expeditions to the New World. So as I mentioned, Smith himself did not make the journey. He did not return to New England after publishing that text. He volunteered his services, but the Puritans preferred someone else. But his expedition narrative did sort of serve one of its principal functions, which was to make further exploration and further conquest possible. So the Puritans did use some of his info, and they certainly used some of his maps when they made the voyage a few years later. So we're sort of starting with the Puritans here in week 4. And there are multiple reasons for that. Part of it is because we're already kind of familiar with them. I mean, we know about the Pilgrims. We know about Plymouth Rock. You know, they first landed in 1620 in what is now Massachusetts. So we've internalized a lot of this history, growing up here or even just living here for a short time. Even if you didn't grow up in the U.S., you don't have to be here very long to sort of absorb some of this mythology, some of this kind of romanticized history that we often have surrounding these early Puritan settlers. So we all know a little bit about this history, but I do think our perceptions are changing a bit in contemporary times. I mean, I feel like I'm old enough, and maybe some of you are also old enough to remember maybe the 80s and the 90s. And I just think back to, school plays in elementary school, sort of the way we viewed the Pilgrims, the way we would dress up for Thanksgiving, the way Thanksgiving itself was sort of taught to us. It was all very romanticized, and the Puritans were often viewed as very virtuous, brave, intrepid. They tamed the wilderness. They carved out a society where none had previously existed, right? These are the traditional ways that this history has been presented. But I think now, increasingly in the last few decades, there's been more pushback against that. And there's been more of a sense that, hey, plenty of cultures already existed here. As we talked about last week, this was only a new place to Europeans. It was not a blank slate, obviously, for the Native Americans already living here. So just a greater cultural appreciation, I think, for Native Americans. Maybe just a little bit more cultural sensitivity has kind of changed maybe some of the ways that we think about the Puritans, some of the ways that we talk about the Puritans. And yeah, they're kind of ambiguous, maybe in some ways. And we can explore a little bit of that today. But it's important to remember, not all of these early English settlers in the 1600s were Puritans. There were other groups, but many of them were religious dissenters. So I think that's something that most of us know about the Puritans. They were sort of persecuted for their religious beliefs. And in fact, many of them had already been expelled from England and had to go and live in the Netherlands before they ever made the voyage over to the future U.S. So they were dissenters from the Church of England. They were not Anglican like the Church of England. So they... we don't need to get too far into this, but just it is important to recognize kind of where they're coming from and a little bit of their background. So there were other dissenting groups, though, Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers. They would have all been considered dissenters because they didn't subscribe to the customs and the conventions of the Church of England. So the Church of England, by this point in history, England is Protestant. The Anglicans, that is a Protestant denomination, but at the time, the Church of England still had a lot in common with Catholicism, and that made a lot of the dissenters uneasy. So, of course, we probably know that England used to be Catholic until Henry VIII, but at this point in history, the 1600s, a lot of the Anglican sort of conventions and traditions still owe a lot to some of the old customs of Catholicism. So the dissenters were simply subscribing to different sets of beliefs, different brands, different forms of Protestant Christianity. So we remember the Puritans more than we remember some of these other groups, not because everybody conformed to the Puritan way of life, but because the Puritans, more than other groups of early settlers, English settlers, they produced texts. That's kind of where I want to start today with our history lesson. They produced texts. And a lot of other early settlers in, say, Virginia or other parts of New England didn't always produce records of their experiences, didn't always, relate their own trials and tribulations. So the Puritans, even though they weren't always producing literature, at least as we would define literature, they were producing a lot of different types of texts. So not only does that help us to kind of understand a little bit about what daily life was like for them, they were also among the first literary producers that we have in the future U.S. So if we're thinking about a national literary history, we sort of start with the Puritans simply because they were the ones producing these early texts. And that's why we start with Anne Bradstreet. Because in many ways, and pretty much the literal sense of this term or this phrase, she really is the first published author in what would later become the U.S. We can consider, and we often do, consider Bradstreet to be the first truly American poet, the first truly American author. Now, as we see, that's going to get a little sticky because Bradstreet herself would not have necessarily defined herself that way. But the Puritans do give us some of the first works of literature ever produced here, and just some of the first texts in general produced by English language settlers in the New World. So we start with them. And again, we know a little bit about the Puritans. We might know a little bit about their belief system. There's sort of an image that they have, I think, in popular culture. They're often thought of maybe as sort of dour, sort of dull, very plain in appearance, very strict, very strictly religious, and most of those things are largely true, but of course we do oversimplify. And it's also important to remember that Puritans are not a monolith, so not all Puritans thought the same way or felt the same things or did the same things or acted the same way. So of course I'm speaking in generalities here, but they were a pretty strict society and a little bit repressed, perhaps, by our modern standards. They certainly didn't practice the kind of social equality that we would want to practice today. But that would be typical of a lot of societies, a lot of groups back then. But we might know that they were Calvinistic. They had a Calvinist belief system, meaning that they believed in predestination. They believed that upon your birth, God has already decided whether or not you are to be saved, whether or not you are among the elect. So, unlike other Christian, Protestant denominations or other denominations, other religions, there really wasn't anything an individual could do. There weren't any actions one could take to secure, salvation. You just had to hope that you were among the chosen. And you wouldn't know that, of course, until, I guess, Judgment Day. So there were other Calvinist groups. I mean, the French Huguenots believed in a form of Calvinism. They were also among the early settlers in what is now the U.S. Even old Presbyterians in sort of the backcountry, they were going up near the Appalachian Mountains. They had certain aspects of this in their sort of tradition and their system. So it wasn't unique to the Puritans, but that is a part of their belief system that we tend to know at least a little bit about. But more importantly for us, what was more important to us when it comes to the Puritans is a concept that we refer to as typology. So we don't need to get too far into this. There's nothing about this in the Week 4 module. I just want to talk about it briefly because it will give us a better context in which to sort of understand Bradstreet and Mary Rowlandson, another Puritan author that I included in this week's readings. She's kind of an optional reading, not one of the required texts, but we can think a little bit about her work as well. So I don't have an expert knowledge of typology. I'll just give you a really sort of brief overview that might not be entirely accurate. But basically, typology is a brand of literary analysis, really, or a type of comparison that really started in the Middle Ages with biblical scholars. And it was largely a process of interpreting sort of figures and events in the Old Testament as in some ways foreshadowing later figures and later events that would appear in both the New Testament and things that might actually happen like in contemporary time. Like they viewed the Bible as a way to predict future events. They viewed the events of the Bible as sort of anticipating or foreshadowing real things that might happen to them and might happen in the world as they knew it. So this was just kind of a way of interpreting the Bible and sort of applying the lessons and the knowledge that came from the Bible, applying those things to the sort of material, everyday world. It's not something that we really still do a lot. I mean, people still practice this. There are still biblical scholars who engage in typology, but this is obviously not as commonly done as it was back then. But some claim that this kind of work that was done with the Bible was kind of the birth of what we think of as like literary scholarship or literary theory or even criticism, because these are early developments in this, in literary analysis, essentially. These are ways to read texts. This is a way to understand the text that was, of course, for much of human history, considered to be the most important of all texts, the Bible. So that's just roughly what typology means. So this would have been the way that Puritans would have sort of understood literature to work as well. So the typological framework could refer to other texts, but those texts always needed to reference the Bible in some way. That was kind of the idea. So for them, all literature, at least one of the primary goals of all literature, was to propagate the true gospel. So that means they favored literature that had a typological scheme at work. So in other words, these would be very allegorical texts oftentimes. I think a lot of us are probably familiar with what allegory is. And this was very common amongst a lot of older types of writing, like ancient epics and medieval passion plays. With allegory, all of the events depicted in the narrative, all the characters, all the things that happen in the plot, they all serve this larger sort of representational function. They're all representing larger things, bigger ideas, certain universal truths or biblical truths, or maybe certain cultural norms or values that were, shared by a lot of people in that particular culture at that particular time. So in some ways, the events of the narrative, while perhaps entertaining in their own right, their primary function, their most important function, was to sort of represent those larger ideas or perhaps biblical precedent. That's what they were supposed to connect to. That's what they were supposed to represent. So that's kind of what I'm getting at here. I mean, a typological framework basically means we're demanding this level of allegory in our works of literature. So the works of literature are designed to sort of celebrate God, but also what's happening in the literature should have some kind of parallel or some kind of connection to a biblical event or a biblical character or an idea or a concept or a value that's found within the Bible. So they weren't anti-literature, but they didn't really believe in sort of art for art's sake, the way a lot of modern people do. For them, art was only valuable if it served some of these higher purposes. So I think for a lot of modern people, even if we are religious, we kind of reject that way of thinking by and large, and we say, well, not all art necessarily has to do that, right? Maybe it's nice if some does, but maybe not all. But of course, they were somewhat rigid and strict in a way that most modern humans really aren't. But we should think about it a little bit more, because in some ways, this sort of typological way of thinking, while it's weird and it's kind of old-fashioned perhaps to us, it actually creates an interesting artistic effect. So there's a 20th century poet named Adrienne Rich. Some of you might be familiar with her. She's mostly known as a poet, a sort of feminist poet, but she's also done some really interesting scholarship and research on Anne Bradstreet and just sort of Puritan literature in general. So I'm not going to read this whole quote, but she has a famous quote where she claims that 17th century Puritan life, so 1600s, this is Bradstreet's time, 17th century Puritan life was perhaps the most self-conscious life ever lived. And that's an interesting quote to me, and I think she might be on to something, and she goes on to talk about this in a lot more depth, but her larger point is because of this way of sort of seeing the world, because typology doesn't just refer to literature, it's kind of how they envisioned themselves. That they kind of viewed themselves like the Israelites, trying to find their way through the wilderness, So they viewed themselves within this typological scheme, not just the text that they read. Everything, both texts and real life, everything was supposed to be sort of contained within that typological, that allegorical framework. So what the poet Rich says is that actually creates a really self-aware person, because you're really living inside your own head quite a bit. Because if you believe that everything in your life has some kind of larger representational importance, like every mundane, every sort of everyday event has some larger importance. It represents something more. Or maybe it provides a clue into God's judgment on you or something, right? But there's this added significance to even relatively insignificant details, because everything has a larger purpose, right? Both the things that we find in texts and there's just sort of the normal mundane details of our everyday lives. So Rich talks about, everything becomes part of the drama of their lives, right? Every random thought that a woman might have while stirring a pot in a kitchen might have some larger significance. So it's something worth exploring. It's not just a throwaway thought. Maybe it represents a thought that somebody had in the Bible, or maybe it connects to an idea or an experience that's existed in some previous biblical context, or maybe it provides a clue into, again, some larger spiritual sort of, puzzle. Everything has this added significance. And I think we can maybe see a little bit of that in Bradstreet, and we can see a little bit of that in Rowlandson for sure. Because Mary Rowlandson in her captivity narrative, which is a good example of a very prominent early Puritan text, in her captivity narrative, she is sticking very close to this typological framework. And I think you guys will notice, because she sort of talks about it. She compares herself to certain figures, and she sort of has a certain way of understanding what's happening to her. She's been taken captive by a group of Native Americans. This was actually a common practice during this early warfare between the Puritan settlers and the Native American tribes of New England. Both sides would take hostages and then try to negotiate later for, certain things that they might need, or this might be a way of bringing about some kind of a ceasefire or a treaty between warring groups. So she's taken prisoner. She's eventually returned to her Puritan society, but while she's in the wilderness living with what she perceived to be savages, she sees a lot of biblical parallels, and that's very much how her text is structured. And it's how she understands these events. So she sticks to the typological framework. That's why I wanted to have her included in the week 4 readings as sort of an example of what I'm talking about. But in many ways, Anne Bradstreet, who we're going to spend more time on, she kind of breaks away from the typological model a little bit. Not entirely, but if we look at the second poem from her, which is an example of some of her later work. So a letter to her husband. If we take a look at that, we're going to notice how inside her own head she is, to use kind of a very inelegant turn of phrase. But I think that's what Rich is talking about when she says self-conscious. Like, that whole poem is basically just Bradstreet thinking about her husband and making a lot of comparisons, thinking about the love she feels for her husband, comparing that love to other things, using a lot of figurative language, using a lot of vivid imagery. But you'll notice that she's not really talking about God, and she's not necessarily trying to place herself or her husband in some kind of larger typological scheme, which would have been sort of the recommended course of action. I think a lot of her earlier poetry does fit in a little bit more with the traditional Puritan way of doing things. But one reason why we find her later work more interesting nowadays is because it strikes a lot of critics and scholars today as more modern, both in terms of its style and in terms of content. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let's just go back and sort of start with Bradstreet and both of her major poetry collections, because she has two, and they represent these two sort of slightly different styles, different subject matters to a certain extent. So for a long time, she's been held up as an important historical figure because, like I said, she is, for all intents and purposes, the first real American author. Now, she would not have thought of herself as American. She was born in England, and she was actually a member of one of the early expeditions that came to Massachusetts. So we all know about Plymouth Rock in 1620. Well, 10 years later, Bradstreet arrives in 1630, along with her husband. They're both members of John Winthrop's expedition. That's a name that should ring a bell, and I've included him on that first slide. We mostly remember him as an early sort of leader of this Puritan community, and he's the author of the famous City on a Hill speech that I've also included as an early example of sort of Puritan writing. It's a sermon that he probably delivered. It wasn't initially set to paper, but it was later recorded. He probably delivered it on the ship, on the Arabella, the ship they journeyed across the Atlantic on, or maybe he delivered it upon landing. We don't know. Nobody will ever know. But the actual name of that text, as we know it now, is A Model of Christian Charity. So he's a pretty important, very influential figure in the early history of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He's kind of the founder of the colony. But John Bradstreet's husband was also kind of an important member of this early sort of leadership. I don't know if he was a politician per se. I think he was a merchant, maybe, but he knew Winthrop, and he was sort of in good with a lot of these other influential early leaders. And Bradstreet herself was born into relative affluence in England, and she was educated, which sort of set her apart from a lot of her fellow women of the time. It wouldn't have been common for women in the 1600s to be as educated as she was. She couldn't really go to school, but she had tutors, and she had a father who actually encouraged her to learn, which again wasn't exactly common for the time period. But then she comes over as a young sort of bride. She comes over to Massachusetts and spends the rest of her life living in what is now Massachusetts. So in the year 1650, she becomes the author of the first published collection of poems ever produced in this country. And really, it's the first real work of literature in English to ever be produced in what would later become the U.S. But what's interesting is Bradstreet herself did not publish it. And she, as far as we can tell, probably did not have any real intention of publishing any of her work, because it would have been viewed as a little bit inappropriate, frankly, for a woman to have a job or to be a writer, really, in any kind of public-facing way. I mean, we suspect that she probably shared some of her work with friends, maybe family. Her husband probably read her poems, but she never really intended to publish. But her brother-in-law, unbeknownst to her, take some of her poems with him on a business trip to England. In 1650, he's going to London, and he takes some of her poems, takes them to a printer or to a publisher, and actually gets them published without her knowledge. I mean, she finds out later, only after the fact. So, 1650, her collection entitled The 10th Muse. It's very influential because it's kind of really the first book, the first work of literature produced as a result of English colonization, right? These are the early stages of English colonization in what would later become the U.S. So this is kind of the first literary document, the first literary artifact from this historical period. So we've understood that about her for a long time. So for many, many years, many decades, she was regarded as a pretty important historical figure. But we didn't often really value her work. At least when I was a student, when I was sort of first learning about Bradstreet, I was mostly told to just sort of appreciate her historical importance and to not really worry too much about, actually reading her poetry. She was often thought of as kind of dull, as many Puritan writers were, and sometimes still are. So I have some quotes here. She's been called tedious. She's been called extraordinarily dull by past critics. And there was another famous 20th century American poet, John Berryman, who had a famous quote about Bradstreet. He called her a boring Puritan who may have been our first American poet, but was not a good one. That's his quote. She's a boring, actually, it's a gendered insult. He says, a boring, high-minded Puritan woman who may have been our first American poet, but was not a good one, end quote. So this was kind of the critical consensus about her for a long time. But in more recent years, we're starting to reevaluate, and we're starting to realize that especially her later collection, which came out in 1678, a few years after her death, so published posthumously, again, without her direct involvement, that second collection of poetry has really grabbed the interest of a lot of contemporary scholars and critics because we think it's more modern, we think it's more accessible to the modern reader, but also it really gets away from a lot of that typology. It gets away from a lot of these older poetic forms and a lot of these older traditions that the 10th Muse is still very much indebted to. The 10th Muse was her first collection, and we're reading a piece from that. So we have a representative text from both her first collection and her later collection. So we're reading the 4 ages of man from the 10th Muse. And then we're reading a letter to her husband absent upon public employment. That comes from her second later collection. So that second later collection is a lot more personal and domestic in terms of subject matter. She's really interested in exploring sort of interpersonal relationships. She writes a lot about the romantic love that she feels for her husband, often in sort of weirdly intimate ways. I mean, it's not sexual or anything, but I think you'll notice in a letter to her husband, it's a very intimate portrait that she ends up painting. So in her later work, she's a lot more interested in interpersonal relationships, with her husband, her parental relationship to her children, and sort of, her family's relationship to the larger community that they are in with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So a lot of modern scholars really dig that second collection, and her tone changes a little bit. Her style changes a little bit. So I have a quote here from another critic. I think this kind of captures the change, and we can observe this. So read the 4 ages of man first. That comes from the 10th Muse. And then take a look at a letter to her husband and notice the stylistic shifts. So the critic here is kind of pointing to these shifts. He says in the second collection, her music, Bradstreet's music, changes. The volume is turned down. The voice becomes at once more private and more intense. A quick walking cadence now accompanies the neighborly, definite voice in which she had previously told her stories. These are cadences that came from the New England moment in which she lived. That's kind of an important idea for us. These new cadences, this new kind of accessible style, according to this critic, it comes from the New England moment in which Bradstreet lived. At last, the old England of her youth was receding. So I don't know if I buy this 100%, but I think he is on to something in the sense that with the 10th Muse, she's very much influenced by older forms and, like I said, older traditions that she would have been familiar with as an English woman and as an educated English woman who had a very well-read family, and she herself was exceptionally well-read. So in the 10th Muse, a lot of her poems are styled in a way that would have been familiar to readers in the 15 and 1600s. I mean, a lot of what she's doing owes a lot to like Elizabethan era England. These are styles and forms, poetic forms that a lot of modern readers just aren't really familiar with and might not really seek out. But when we turn to her second collection, again, they're just easier to read. The poems tend to be shorter. She's still always using some kind of fixed form. So I know a lot of modern day poets just use sort of open verse. It can be whatever you want. You don't have to follow a meter. You don't have to follow any kind of rhyme scheme or stanzaic division. But in the 1600s, all poets would have been working within some kind of form. So she continues to use set forms in her later work, but the subject matter is more relatable. Again, like this critic says, the language becomes a little bit more, I guess characteristic of the life that she led, the people that she lived with, the realities of her life. She's no longer drawing so much on those older English precedents. And this makes sense, right? She wrote a lot of those poems that were in the 10th Muse relatively early in life, early in her time in Massachusetts, when she still had a lot of memories of England fresh in her mind. And she was obviously still influenced by a lot of the authors that she read when she was younger, English authors, European authors. But as she lives in Massachusetts for a longer time, her experiences become more centered on New England and the unique realities that she's encountering in this place, which are, of course, very different circumstances than she would have encountered back in England if she had stayed there. So in that second collection, I can't remember the name of it now, but in that second collection that comes out in 1678, again, we see more focus on the domestic, more focus on relationships. And we don't always talk about God. I mean, God's always kind of there, hovering for the Puritans. But if you notice, in the letter to her husband, I don't think God directly appears. I don't think she really references God in a direct way, in an overt way. Maybe I'm forgetting a line or an image, but for the most part, she's just focused on her husband. But what I think is interesting in that poem is she's very much in her own head. She's very much just sort of reflecting. And again, that's what rich means. These were a very self-conscious people, right? Because if everything has this allegorical significance, well, that could include the romantic love that she has for her husband. She doesn't directly tie that to God, but notice how she takes all these flights of fancy and she's able to arrive at all these figurative sort of comparisons or these various figurative ways to sort of describe her feelings, to describe her thoughts. But the whole poem consists of her thoughts and feelings. There's no real physical action. She's not really doing anything in that poem physically. It's all taking place in her head. And she seems to really be interrogating her own thoughts, her own feelings. And Rich and other scholars say, yeah, a lot of Puritans would have done that. just because of their typology, because of their allegorical ways of reading and seeing the world. So that does kind of make them interesting writers, and at times it makes them sort of interesting narrators. I don't know if that's always true, but I do think it's true with Bradstreet. But if we go back to the Four Ages of Man, which comes from the 10th Muse, we'll notice a much more sort of old-fashioned, almost archaic style that, again, would have been familiar in the first half of the 1600s or in the 1500s. It feels maybe a little bit less familiar to us today. But, again, the 10th Muse, first collection of English language poetry ever published in the New World. And just remember it really as the first English language book ever produced in the New World. That's how we're going to refer to it. But as far as like a super fun read, I don't know that a lot of people would consider it that. Some of you might be interested in it. I mean, for me, it's dry, it is a bit tedious, and it can be a bit challenging, frankly. And you might see some of that with the piece that we're reading. But the whole first part, I think, first half of the 10th Muse is made up of these 4 long poems, and we are reading one of them. So we have the 4 elements, the 4 humors of man, the 4 ages of man, that's the one we're reading, and then finally the 4 seasons. So we can kind of sense a pattern here. So she referred to these very long poems as the 4 quaternions. Now, we don't have a lot of people writing things called quaternions anymore, but I'm sure some do. But these are all like orations delivered by these sort of non-human entities. So again, this was sort of a somewhat familiar stylistic register at the time period. These are sort of like philosophical or historical treatises, really. These poems in the 10th Muse really demonstrate Bradstreet's breadth of knowledge. Like I said, she was very well educated, not just well read. Not just sort of superficially cultured in the way that a lot of well-born women would have been expected to be at this time, but she was also well-versed in a lot of different academic disciplines. So some of this might show up to you in the 4 Ages of Man, but she knows a lot about history, philosophy, physiology, anatomy, Greek metaphysics, a lot of stuff that, frankly, I know very little about. Medieval and Renaissance cosmology. So it's a very learned discourse. It almost reads like philosophy or history at times, but she also brings in some personal experiences to help dramatize some of the images and ideas that she's describing. So some people do enjoy the 4 Ages of Man, but just read that one first. Notice the style, the subject matter, the length, the density, the amount of information. And again, it's a real testament to her breadth of learning and knowledge. But then when we turn to her later work, in a letter to her husband, absent upon public employment, we see the more domestic, we see the more personal and the more intimate side of Bradstreet. So again, we value these later works because we think they provide more insight into what life was really like for Puritans during this early stage of U.S. colonial history. Whereas her earlier work owed more to English stuff and European traditions. So this is going to be a trend that we notice over the course of the semester. A lot of these early American writers are valued, at least in part, because they import old styles, oftentimes from England, but then they do weird things with them to adapt, to sort of adapt those old styles to a new place, to a new culture, a new country, a new society. And in other cases, the writers slowly move away from those old styles, from those existing precedents, and they increasingly develop new styles, new music, to use the language of that critic, new cadences, a sort of new way of doing things that's more appropriate, more suitable to America. So Bradstreet might be viewed as sort of the first writer that we can observe going through that process. And a lot of other writers that follow her will go through a similar process. Okay, so that's mostly all I have on the Puritans, but let me just mention Rowlandson again. She published her captivity narrative in 1682. So a few decades after Bradstreet's first volume of poetry came out. So Rowlandson is also remembered largely for this text, and the captivity narrative as a genre was popular during this time. It was not created by the Puritans. It already existed in Europe. And again, it's one of these old sort of literary genres that gets imported to a certain extent to the U.S. and sort of adapted to the circumstances and the geography and realities that the Puritans and these other early settlers found themselves in. So you can take a look at Rowlandson, and again, you might notice how she's using typology like I described earlier, the way she's understanding her experiences. So she was very much within that mold, but Bradstreet may be a little bit more modern, maybe doing some more interesting things. And then the final Puritan writer I wanted to mention here, again, you can see the complete list in my slides, but the final one I wanted to mention here was this guy, Benjamin Church. And he's on the slide as well. I wish we had time to actually read him. I think he's a really interesting figure. If anyone's interested in like Westerns or the American frontier or certain ideas we have about the frontier and sort of frontier heroes as they function in American popular culture, we have a long tradition of this character type. Church is kind of where all of that starts from a literary perspective. So he was a real person, and he took part in one of the major early military events, or sort of military conflicts of this early era of English colonization. So as you guys probably know, the Puritans, after initially having some friendly relations with various Native American tribes, very soon entered into warfare with many of those same groups, and there were several wars fought throughout the 1600s in New England and of course in Virginia, the other major colony that was already underway by this point, and others would soon follow. But the sort of pinnacle, the sort of, turning point, really, when it comes to the English and the sort of future of their colonial project in the New World was King Philip's War, which took place in the 1670s. Now, King Philip was the anglicized version of a Native American chieftain's name, Metacomet, and he brought together this very strong confederation of different Native American tribes, the Narragansetts, the Wampanoags, a lot of various tribes that the Puritans had been in conflict with, and they sort of banded together. Many of them joined forces to wage war against the English in an attempt to try to expel the English from New England. Ultimately, the English did emerge victorious, but the outcome was in doubt early on. They suffered many setbacks, many defeats. So Benjamin Church becomes one of the early military heroes in the history of this sort of English colonial period. So he's an Englishman. He was a Puritan living in what is now Rhode Island. But he was I think we all know people like this. Like, he grew up in the Puritan tradition, but he was the type who maybe didn't go to every single church service. Maybe he didn't really buy into all the precepts, all the tenets of his belief system. But he was sort of distrusted by other members of his community because he went out and lived with Native Americans for a while. But that stuff came in handy. The knowledge that he gained came in handy once the war started, because he eventually comes and fights on the side of the English. And his knowledge of Native American warfare, the terrain, he learns a lot about the geography. He learns a lot about various alliances and feuds existing between Native American groups. So he uses all of that knowledge to make a long story short, he uses all that knowledge to help the English eventually win the war, and he becomes one of their leading commanders. But he's always sort of held at arm's length by the sort of more prim and proper Englishmen who are forming these early militia groups. They don't really trust Church because he's been living out in the wilderness, and they think that he may have even taken a Native American wife. That's not confirmed. But anyway, in the year 1716, a book comes out called Entertaining Passages Relating to King Philip's War. Very clunky title, but it's basically the story of Benjamin Church's experiences in that war leading the English against their Native American enemies. It was compiled by either his son or his grandson. I think it was his grandson. But Church was dead by 1716. But his grandson, or maybe it was his son, got a hold of his diary, essentially. He had maintained a diary throughout the war, sort of recording his experiences, talking about what happened, and then later his descendant, whoever the hell it was, still with the last name Church, of course, published it. And this helped to kind of make Benjamin Church our first sort of frontier hero. And we're going to talk more about this character type later in the semester. But if you've ever seen a movie starring John Wayne, if you've ever seen a Western, an old-timey Western, or even a more contemporary one, you're probably familiar with this character type. We're going to learn about its development over time. James Fenimore Cooper in the 1820s would help to really advance it with the leather stocking figure. If you've ever watched Last of the Mohicans, or if you've ever had the misfortune of having to read Cooper, you're probably familiar with the leather stocking figure. So the frontier hero, he has to be white, traditionally, right? It's got to be a man, but typically he goes and lives with Native Americans, or at least he knows a lot about Native Americans. So he's kind of separate from mainstream white society because he's different, he's weird, whatever. But then when the going gets tough and conflict begins, he comes to the aid of his fellow white people, and he uses the knowledge that he's gained amongst Native Americans to ultimately benefit the white people. I mean, this story gets played out over and over again throughout various stages of American history. But if we're just looking at texts, if we're just looking at narratives, committed to paper, Church's story and the story of the King Philip's War is kind of the original version of this tale that will get retold over and over and over again up until really the end of the 19th century. So Church is just interesting as sort of a historical footnote, but also, like Bradstreet, he kind of breaks away from that typological scheme that the Puritans favored. One thing that strikes us now about Church is he's all about number one. He's very self-aggrandizing. He talks a lot about himself. I mean, it's a first-person narrative, so obviously he would. But unlike Rowlandson, unlike some of the other Puritan writers who would have connected all of their experiences to those biblical precedents, those biblical foreshadowings, Church doesn't really do that. I mean, he gives thanks to God sometimes, like when he survives a difficult battle. But for the most part, he's just talking about what a great commander he is. And he also gives credit to the many Native American soldiers serving under him. So a weird part of his text is we realize that a lot of the sort of the war is largely turned, according to Church, thanks to him and his native allies. So these are largely Christianized Native Americans who have already sort of adopted certain aspects of Western society and sort of English culture, maybe not entirely, and there was still obviously a lot of racial segregation. They didn't really live with the white people or go to church with them, with some exceptions, but they had friendlier relations. And Church himself seems to have kind of a personal following of these Christianized Native Americans who were his allies and were fighting with the English against these other tribes, often because they may have been the historical enemies of some of these tribes that were fighting under King Philip, or it might have been brought about by the fact that many of these natives had converted to Christianity. But anyway, we're not reading church, so I don't need to talk about it so much. But it's just an interesting text. And again, it has parallels to Cabeza de Vaca. You should never forget that when Cabeza de Vaca finally meets up with that slaving expedition of Spaniards near the Pacific, he's not with Dorantes or Castillo. Who are his companions at that point? We talked about this. It's Estevancio, and it's like 11 Native Americans. And that same kind of trope shows up in church. Some of the most pivotal moments in the war, in his narrative, they happen because of Native Americans, his Native American allies. And he makes that very clear. But anyway, he's kind of all about himself, ultimately. He really trumpets his own importance and how the English basically would not have won without him. So he's kind of violating that typological scheme. So he and Bradstreet are remembered as, in some ways, more modern writers because they're anticipating future developments and they're breaking free of some of the rigid rules that, kind of governed all aspects of Puritan society, but certainly writing and literature. But again, Puritans were often very interesting, so I do think sometimes they kind of get a bad rap. I don't agree with a lot of their positions on things, as most of us probably don't, but at least in the form of Bradstreet, and I would argue Church, we do get some of the first American authors and some of the first really interesting American texts. Okay, so I'm going to stop part one there. And when we come back, we're going to sort of continue our survey of colonial American literary production. And we're going to move into the 1700s, and we're going to talk about some other important developments, and then we're going to move into the early national period. So again, we're covering a lot of ground. The colonial period obviously will continue until the late 18th century. And then we become an independent nation in the 1780s. So at that point, we enter into a new era, the era of the early republic, also called the early national period. So we're going to talk about the early stages of that period as well. And we're going to work our way all the way up to about the year 1800. That's where we're going to stop this week. So come back for part two, and we'll keep going.